Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. I mean, this is, as you all know, the graveyard session after lunch, which meant that you have had a very enjoyable lunch. And therefore, we will intend to bring you enormous amount of energy for this session around rethinking energy security in a geopolitically competitive world. My name is Bernice. I'm the Hoffmann Distinguished Fellow for Sustainability here at Chatham House. And having had the pleasure, like everybody else today really, of returning back to the same venue after 3 years of being away. And honestly, last time we were here, we had the same topic, but a very different set of mindset. And I think that if you had been here this morning, you would have heard as well from everybody the extent to which this feels very much like a return of history in many ways. But at the same time, while geopolitics might be striking back, at the same time, we're also grappling with many, many of the new challenges. So today, what we have today is a panel that will help us think through some of these challenging questions. I mean, this morning we heard many different things. We had, obviously, the Secretary of State for Energy and Business here, also talking a lot about how obviously the invasion is resetting a lot of the parameters that we are thinking around energy security and energy geopolitics. And the question that sort of is left in my mind quite strongly really is the extent to which the new geopolitics is really reconfiguring the energy order, or this new energy order together with climate change and also cost of living crisis and polarization is reconfiguring, in fact, the other way around, the new geopolitics. So is it that the new geopolitics is recreating the new energy order, or the new energy/climate order is going to create new forms of geopolitics? I think that is one of the big questions that I hope our panel will be helping us to grapple with today. The second question that I have really is, we heard a lot as well today about how we're moving away from interdependencies and interconnectedness to much more domestic strife, domestic production, regionalization. So we're away from interconnectedness and interdependencies to very different kinds of politics as well, at different level. So I think what would be extraordinarily valuable today as we hear from our four excellent speakers is to think through some of these questions from different perspectives and to think through what is it that will make for the next generation of energy policy and energy thinking, but also more importantly, how will it affect the assumptions that we make in terms of moving forward with all the major issue of policy that we have to figure out, which include, of course, energy security, climate security, as well as, obviously, affordable, sustainable cost of living as well, among others. So with that, let me quickly introduce our four speakers in the order that I think I would like to hear from them today. They will all kick us off with 3 to 5 minutes of opening remarks, and then we will be having a moderated discussion with not just questions from me, but also from the audience as well. And I know that from what I heard this morning, we know that there are lots of very knowledgeable and engaged folks in this debate in the room. And I certainly would encourage you to show your hands, because if not, I will show your hand for you, because I know some of you as well, just so you know, so that you are prepared to sort of be helping us think through some of the questions. Now, first up today, we have Meghan O'Sullivan, who's a Director, Geopolitics of Energy Project from the Harvard Kennedy School. If you all have access to the biography, so you will know what an illustrious career she has had. But what you don't know, by the way, and I'm not sure she remembers, is that about 20 years ago, back in the day when she was at Georgetown, she did a year at Oxford. And actually, weirdly, we were at the same college at the time when I was an undergraduate as well. So it is a great delight for me to see her here today on screen. And second, we have Melanie Kenderdine, who's Principal Executive Vice President of the Energy Futures Initiative. Like Meghan, also has had a very illustrious career as well in the US government, with very different roles in the DOE, among others. And next, we have Saleem Fakir, who's the Executive Director of the African Climate Foundation, who will bring to us a perspective from, obviously, not only Africa, but also his years of environmental activism as well, via WWF, among others. Last but certainly not least, we have Jonathan Pershing, who's a Program Director of Environment at the Hewlett Foundation. And he also has had, like the other two American participants here, which are the speakers we have here, which we are delighted to have, a very illustrious career as well. Most recently returned from a stint working with, obviously, the Special Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, and before then was the Climate Envoy as well for the US, among others, and have led important jobs as well at DOE and in different think tanks as well. I am sparing you me reading out their bio, knowing that you're perfectly capable of figuring out who they are and their illustrious track record. And I just want to say that you didn't come from the green room that I just came from, which is to hear these two having a debate between them. So I mean, if that was a preview to the kind of debate we're going to have today, I believe that you're in here for a real treat. So I'm going to encourage all our speakers to remind ourselves that what we really would like is to make sure that we are staying at the hovercraft level, i.e. big picture, but at the same time we have enough nitty-gritty and nuggets to make sure that we help our audience and everyone, the 500 people registered online, to get a grip of the issue. So both the big picture as well as the specifics, because I think that very few people would disagree that we have to deliver multiple policy goals at the same time. Energy security, climate security, economic security. The question will be increasingly about how. So first, Meghan, why don't you kick us off, please?
Excellent. Good afternoon, and thanks, Bernice, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with Chatham House. I'm only sorry I'm not there in person. And Bernice, I have to say, it wasn't 20 years ago, it was 30 years ago. So just to date us a little bit. Anyway, I think the questions that you laid out at the beginning were really prepare us for a very excellent conversation. Your overriding question about, is it going to be energy shaping geopolitics or geopolitics shaping energy? The answer undoubtedly has to be both, because every time there's a big change in the energy system, we have to anticipate a very significant change in geopolitics. And the same is true vice versa. If we just look at what's happening with Russia today, we can see how that is reordering the energy landscape. But when we think about the energy transition, this movement away from carbon intensive fuels to ultimately zero carbon fuels, that in my mind is going to be the biggest geopolitical risk of the coming decades. You know, we're only 22 years into this century, but already we've had 3 historic events: the pandemic, the Russian invasion, and the ongoing energy transition. All of them have big implications for geopolitics. But I think when we look back at the first half of this century, those of us who are still around to do it, I think it will be without question that the energy transition will be the one with the largest geopolitical impact. Let me just say a couple of words. I know we want to get off to a crisp start. First, I would say, as has already been discussed to some extent today, this is an energy crisis that is still unfolding. There are many dimensions to this, as everyone is aware. It's not like the 70s where it was just about oil. This is about oil, about gas, about coal, even about enriched nuclear fuel. So there's still many dimensions that haven't fully played out. And there are a lot of significant uncertainties related to the Russian gas cutoffs, related to the sanctions response, both of Europe and the United States, which is still not fully fleshed out. And of course, the economy, the impact on the economy and the increasing predictions of a recession and what that will do for demand may be ultimately the thing that, for better or for worse, gets us out of this phase of the energy crisis. But let me just say 4 things. I'm going to mention them very briefly in the hope and expectation that we'll be able to come back to them in greater detail. 4 ways in which I think this current energy dynamic is going to be reshaping the geopolitical order and the energy order going forward. First, Bernice, as you mentioned, is the issue of energy security. As this audience will know very well, energy security has been catapulted back up the policy agenda. Whereas just a year ago, if we were speaking about energy security, particularly in Europe, you were really regarded, almost in the language of the US, almost as a climate denier, looking backwards rather than looking forwards. Now I think there's the appreciation that a failure to provide energy security in the short term can be the potentially biggest threat to a successful energy transition by really sapping a society of the ability and willingness to take the hard steps that we're going to have to take to make this energy transition. Secondly, I would say, I predict, we're moving into a new era of government intervention in energy markets. And, to some extent, this may make people recall the 70s, and that I would say was an era of ill-advised government intervention in energy markets that actually exacerbated crises rather than ameliorated them. I think we're moving into a place where there's more hope and potential and certainly need for intelligent government intervention in markets. We can talk about what we're seeing now in the policy landscape versus what should be done. Thirdly, and I'm hoping Saleem will talk more about this, but one of the geopolitical impacts of this energy transition and the changing geopolitical situation because of the invasion of Ukraine, I think will be a deepening divide between the developed world and the developing world. And we need to be very cognizant of that if we are not to, one, if we are going to be successful in our transition, and understanding that that divide, which can be exacerbated by the fact that the developing world is going to be the part of the world that bears the cost of climate change the most severely, yet has the least responsibility for creating the crisis. If we don't address that head on, I think we're going to find ourselves compromised not only in the ability to address a warming climate, but also in a range of other really important geopolitical issues, from migration to counterterrorism, a whole host of geopolitical issues. And then finally, and I'm using this as, I hope, a segue to my colleagues on the panel, that there is this whole question about what this means for what the geopolitical crisis of the day in Russia and Ukraine really means for the long-term pace and scope and scale of the energy transition and addressing climate change. Certainly, if we look just at the short-term measures, it seems like a significant step backwards. I think it's an open question about whether Europe and the United States will use this opportunity to expedite their move into the transition. And again, coming back to the developing world, a lot of it will rest on how the developing world is able and what kind of support it gets from the rest of the world to make this transition in a situation where not only it has to balance the need for energy access, but also will be in the midst of an energy crisis, a food crisis, an inflation crisis. So a lot on the plate of policymakers. And again, thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for setting the scene for us very well, and also reminding me that as a chair that I failed you by reminding you that this is on the record, and so please feel free to treat it. Reminding us as well, of course, of the primacy of energy security, the possibility of north-south divide, but also the important thing to focus on, the implications as well for the pace and scope for the energy transition. So with that in mind, Melanie, can I pass to you, please?
Great, thank you, and thank you all for being here. And she just stole all my lines, so I don't have anything to, just joking. Let me say, it's actually worth looking at a little bit of history. And I obviously come at this from a US focus, but in 2003, Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Fed, went and testified before a congressional committee that North America was running out of natural gas. And what a change we have seen since then with shale gas development. And I was working on that at the time and had no appreciation for the technologies and their application for oil as well. And so what the shale gas revolution did in the United States was, in the end, give the United States an incredibly valuable geostrategic position that we are seeing today in the dispute with Russia and Ukraine. So that's one thing that I would put on the table. Another, and Jonathan and I have worked together for many, many years, and I'm a PowerPoint slide freak, and a couple of years ago, I put together a slide of net zero countries. There were 17 of them, maybe 3 years ago. A year and a half ago, there were 130 countries. So in a very, very short period of time, the world is committing to net zero targets. So something else that we need to consider as we're working through all of these issues right now that are very, very difficult is that so many countries in the world have net zero targets. Another thing I would point out, and that we need to be thinking about in the US and Europe, it's not just the US and Europe, this is a global problem. And another data point in putting together another slide, in 1 year, 2 countries in the world, and it was 2018, 2 countries in the world, China and India, had under construction, not announced projects, actually under construction, 165,000 megawatts of coal generation. The entire US coal fleet is 235,000 megawatts. So in 1 year, they were putting that many coal plants into operation. So that to me begs questions about what kind of technologies we need to be focusing on to get to net zero and all those targets in the world. And obviously carbon capture and sequestration is one of them. And then I wanted to make the point also about the developing and the developed world. I spoke to a group of Chinese scientists last week, looked at per capita emissions in China, a developing country. Per capita emissions, CO2 emissions, were 1.5 tons per person. US is 13. And it just illustrates how we have to be very, very cognizant of our contribution in the United States and the developed world to the problem of climate change, and that we need to be working and helping other countries if we are going to reach all of these net zero targets. And then one other thing, and Jonathan and I were working together then, they are still relevant now. In 2014, when Russia, we called it an incursion then, now it's an invasion and a takeover, an incursion in Crimea, the G7 got together and they developed a new set of energy security principles. Up till that point, energy security had been all about barrels of oil, quite frankly. And we thought there was a need to modernize those energy security principles. Climate change was, at that point in time, identified as an energy security problem in those principles. Also, we identified the need for multiple sources of energy, conventional energy, and multiple routes for supplying energy, with a focus on natural gas. At that time, I think that that's an issue now. Also, there was efficiency, innovation, and your traditional emergency response. But those energy security principles, we didn't think about metals and minerals then in 2014. I would add those to the energy security principles. We hadn't thought about cyber in 2014 either. Another thing I would add, the G7, those were adopted by the G7 in 2014. I think they need some updating, but I think they are very, very relevant today. Climate change and natural gas and oil. And that's what we are seeing, and I think that it's imperative that we recognize that both the clean energy transition that we are all supporting needed to address climate change and energy security concerns must be part of the same conversation.
Brilliant. And as we are building also the four speakers as well, so next we'll go to Saleem. And just to remind you quickly that obviously we have Meghan setting out originally for us the sort of the four elements, which is around energy security, government intervention, near of north-south divide, but also the whole pace and scope around decarbonized and energy transition. With now Melanie also pointing out and adding to the list as well questions around technology and manpower, but also in addition to the more traditional supply-related issues, but also the technology around, obviously the clean energy, especially around the critical minerals and supply of those, adding to the equation, and obviously the key question around gas's role, which was the one that was also discussed this morning quite a lot in our first panel. Now with that, it gives you a really quite a long list of things, Saleem, to respond to from your understanding around the Africa-related situation. And we will have many more questions around the COP this year, also going to be an Africa COP2 later. But with that in mind, would you like to address some of these questions about energy security, government intervention, among others that the previous speakers have raised by now, and pace and scope of energy transition and technology and manpower? Wow, long list.
I just want to check if you can hear me clearly.
Very well.
Okay, thank you very much. First, let me make some opening remarks, and I want to pick on maybe 4 or 5 issues that are sort of germane to this discussion. First, to say that it is the return of history, but not the end of history. And I think you remember that phrase where it was coined. But I do want to argue that there was a level of optimism in the last year or two, in that the world has put a very clear marker around the net zero ambition. And I think, as Melanie has pointed out, we have a vaster community of people that are seeking to collectively drive this. The net zero ambition is largely dependent on three assumptions, which I think will be tested in the new geopolitical reordering that is happening, given that energy security is gaining primacy over what I would call climate objectives. And it's still to be seen whether those two can be aligned. The first is that the first assumption is that transitions were largely driven by scale and innovation in 5 technology areas. The one is renewables, battery technology, hydrogen, EVs, AI. I think I have 6, sorry. It's small modular reactor. We haven't talked about it because it's a sort of controversial issue amongst environmental activists, but it is out there. And these technologies are at different levels of development and learning curves. So that's the first thing. The second assumption is that, particularly in the Western world, these will largely be driven by, these net zero targets will largely be driven by market forces, if not most delegated to voluntary measures and forces, with carbon market mechanisms being an incentive for adoption. The third big assumption, which I think is the one that we are busy seeing, that is now becoming more visible, is that transitions are something like a linear ordered thing. You know, the more scale, the more linear, without friction. In fact, I think there'll be a lot of friction, and it's got to do with the fact that in these key technologies, key geopolitical blocks and states are interested in strategic competition and market access and market development. There will be questions around IP. There will be questions around how finance can be used as a lever for market expansion and advancement. There are questions around the supply of critical minerals, and we know who has dominance over some of them, like rare earths. And these critical minerals have overlaps with digital, space, and military technologies. Let's not lose sight of that. And the need for, particularly in emerging and developing countries and in Africa, to lock upscaling of technology with industrial development and other economic development imperatives. So let me go back to this question of decarbonization and the sort of new world we are entering in, and what I would call the new phase of transition reality, that we are moving from sort of the landscape of utopia to what are the facts on the ground. There are several facts on the ground that I think we cannot escape. That climate negotiations are taking place against a backdrop where the international multilateral system is adrift. And we don't have to look very far. The WTO is a great example of that, which challenges the principles of the idea of collective action, common civilizational approach to tackling these problems. It challenges the principles of common and differentiated responsibility. And these are largely being bended by the interests of geopolitical blocs that will shape the nature of the negotiations, the pace at which these commitments can be met, and the other interests that will be aligned, the questions of finance, trade policy, and technology competitiveness. These are all the rival interests that are coming and stress testing the notion of collective action. The second part is that there's a huge friction between energy security and climate security, as we have it now. And in fact, Ursula von der Leyen, when she was signing a deal in Egypt, ironically, on gas, which the EU was seeking to exit itself from, acknowledged that trying to meet the EU's goal of the Green Deal and net zero is somewhat challenged because they have to solve their energy security problem and deal with the rise in inflation, both in the US and other developed economies. So we are effectively, she acknowledged, a fork in a road in which any kind of reality may prevail, because none of these deals that are being signed are short-term deals, they're actually long-term deals, and they will extend the period in which we can actually expand the pace of the transition. So we cannot assume that transition will not be without pain, and that the old assumptions will have to be revisited in the new one. The third part is that the world is definitely facing an inflation bogey. I think economists are having debates whether it is a transitory effect or a long-term effect. There are scholars like Charles Goodhart, who's a monetary scholar who's arguing that inflation will be around for a long time. There are many factors other than energy that is pushing cost of living up. These have major consequences for political governance, for politicians, for states and firms in the long term. The fourth part is Africa is on a crossroads. Its economies are needing to recover from the pandemic. The Ukraine war has not helped. Europeans have and are racing to make new deals on oil, gas, and coal. There's a surge in demand that is laying the platform, what I would call a transition commodity boom. The problem of monetizing gas, as an example, is reproducing old dependencies and perpetuates enclave economies in Africa and other developing countries. But there are also opportunities, let's not forget that. The capture of global demand in premium price for oil and gas producing countries are also forcing them to relook, last point, at their own energy mix and find ways to reduce domestic consumption. 2/3 of African gas goes to domestic consumption. Both Algeria, Egypt, and Nigeria are looking to reduce subsidies for domestic consumption and exploit export markets, and hopefully re-look at the energy mix. So I'll leave it at that. I had one more point, but I can come back to it later. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm pretty sure that there will be questions about Africa gas later today. So with that, Jonathan, we got reminded of many additional factors, including inflation and other technology challenges as well. Jonathan, over to you. Your 3 to 5 minutes.
Great. Thanks very much, Bernice, and it's great to be on the panel and to have a chance to talk about these issues. I was interested in coming at it from a slightly different perspective, which is much nearer term and perhaps somewhat more parochially focused on Europe. So at the moment, we've got a long-term trajectory. I think, Bernice, in your framing, you put it together. I think Meghan did the same, as did Melanie and Saleem. I look at this, though, with these multiple timelines that seem essential for our consideration. So I'd like to focus...
Sorry, Bernice, I'm not hearing. Seem to have difficulty hearing.
Can you guys...
Unable to hear.
Meghan, you can hear?
Now I can hear. I wasn't able to previously. Thank you.
Great. So I think I'm interested in this near-term question, because to a certain extent, the things that we choose to do over the course of the next, let's call it 6 months to 1 year, will have very long-term consequences. We are currently in the middle of a crisis of energy in Europe, and frankly, I would argue that only a few people are paying adequate attention to it. I want to put a couple of numbers on the table to put this into context. At the moment, Europe takes about 160 BCM of gas from Russia. It looks certainly plausible that that could be cut off, at least in substantial measure, by this winter. And yet the majority of actions that are currently being taken to address that will have virtually no impact by this winter because they call for new infrastructure. And infrastructure takes years to put in place. So while they might have a benefit by 2025, or in the analysis that we've seen made public by the European Commission in 2027 or 2030, they'll have virtually no change for this year's impact. The gas goes into a couple of places. It goes into residential activity. And if we think about that, it seems implausible to imagine that Europe's going to cut off gas supplies for heating over the course of the winter. The gas goes into power. There's clearly capacity to switch over and think about other sources of power, some of which might be, for example, from coal. Others might be from replacing gas through other sources of routes and supplies that Melanie kind of raised. Others might be renewables. But let's take a look at each of those in turn, because it turns out that there, too, you have constraints. We can actually land enough gas through LNG to make up about 160 of the 167 BCM, a substantial share. And yet 95 BCM of that cannot be moved through continental Europe. We don't have the pipelines. We can't distribute it. So in some ways, the problem may not be a supply constraint, it may be a distribution constraint. And that brings you to the last piece, which is where is it going? It's going in the third measure to industry. And if we look at this in the next year to 2 years, it looks like there will not be enough gas to supply industry. And how do you curtail? What does it mean for the economies as you do that? And then the slightly longer term plays out. How long do you think gas prices will stay high? And inasmuch as industry has been reliant on gas prices that are remarkably low because of secured long-term contracts with Russia, and those go up, what happens? And yet almost all the policy has been devoted to new contracts. Contracts that return 20 or 30-year horizons for places that cannot deliver quickly. Let's take the other side. If I deliver all the pieces that Europe has put on the table for Fit for 55, which is its commitment to a 55% reduction, and it delivers on the new Repower EU programs, I get a substantial amount of outcome. If I were to augment that with behavioral change and convince people to turn their thermostats down, I could add close to 40 BCM of collective additional capacity. And yet the current policies are not in train to deliver this year or next year, and only really begin to bite the year after that. So I would argue in our security discussion, we need to think about both time frames. We need to think about what's happening right now, because that's the crisis of the moment, and how we use that to move forward. And if we do, by the year 2025, if we delivered on all these repower issues and Fit for 55 issues, we wouldn't need any Russian gas. We wouldn't actually need most of the coal that probably runs a bit longer. We wouldn't actually need much behavioral change because those things could fit. So we're now at a moment where the climate agenda could be complementary only in the next couple of years to the security agenda. And I want to add one last point. If Europe delivers on this, my sense is there's a demonstration effect. Others will see a country or a community of countries moving forward with an aggressive effort. If we don't, my view as a longtime observer of the climate process, there will be many who will track that and say, if Europe, under these circumstances, couldn't make the change, why would you expect China or India or the US to do the same? Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think I'd quite like to come back to that at some point in terms of a some more detailed program. But one of the things that we have noticed about this energy security debate in recent months is, I think that many of you would have seen since you're here, that there's an article in the FT at the beginning of the Russian invasion about how the Russian invasion means that I was right all along about X, Y, and Z. And in some ways, I mean, many people are saying what they have always said in some ways, put it in the context of the invasion. So I just want to ask our panelists to reflect a little bit on what has surprised you, in fact, so that it isn't just about how this is proving that you were right all along, which I'm sure all of you were right all along, but what actually have you thought was actually a bit of a sort of surprise that actually made you rethink some of your assumptions. So would you like to start, Meghan?
Sure. Thank you, Bernice. And I'll resist the urge to twist that and say, well, here are the 5 ways in which maybe I had some ideas. I think that the biggest way, and that my analysis probably was skewed, and I think this was true of the analysis of many people who inhabit the world of geopolitics and energy, was in gaming out what geopolitical conflict with Russia would look like and what impact it would have on the energy relationship. I think there was always the assumption, and for the years that I spent in the US government, and there was a lot of focus on trying to encourage Europe to diversify its energy resources, but the assumption was always that any kind of fracturing of that relationship would come from Russia and would come fairly early on at the start of a conflict. So we were always imagining a scenario where Russia would cut off gas to European economies. And actually, it's taken 4 months in to get to that place where Russia is now sort of much more systematically, as Jonathan mentioned, cutting off the gas supply. And instead, I think, which we had a lack of imagination, is to imagine a conflict that the desire to cut off the energy relationship actually came from the European side, in light of the desire not to be funding Russian activities, in this case in Europe, but potentially in other cases abroad. So I think imagining the landscape under which this geopolitical energy moment would happen is one area where I think very few people, including myself, had any foresight.
It's very interesting, the idea that the conscious uncoupling happened despite a lot of thinking that went happen. And I suspect that this
We're
might be
struggling
not.
to hear you again.
So our technical colleagues, could you please make sure that our colleagues on the screen can hear us as well? I was saying that it's very interesting indeed, the dynamic around the conscious uncoupling happened. I wonder whether or not this is not a bad place to move to Melanie as well, therefore, around the supply chain question, around critical minerals and supply. Whether or not this conscious uncoupling really happened one-sidedly, or in some sense it's happening in such a way, US and China, simultaneously, to the extent that it can become another black swan.
I would totally agree that Russian behavior and the extent to which they have gone to alienate customers in Europe and alienate a lot of the world is a complete shock to me. And although there are some things that I was worried about from the beginning, I was very, very surprised that Nord Stream 2 was adopted. And because we were always worried about that, are you creating additional dependence on Russia by building Nord Stream 2? And so I think that was a shock to me. Russian behavior is a shock to me. And I studied Russian history, so even so, it was shocking to see what they have done, and how upsetting it could be to the world order. So that's something that I worry a lot about. And the Nord Stream 2, I think it does push us into a more, I don't want to say reasonable position, but where we need to be thinking about meeting our climate goals and our energy security goals in a very, very sequenced and thoughtful way. It's not going to be all wind and solar in 10 years, and I think that the reliance on oil and gas has been driven home by what has happened with Russia and Europe. And we need to look at that very carefully, and how do we deal with that as a matter of policy.
Brilliant. I thought that it's good to sort of break it up and sort of bring it to Saleem a little bit. I hope you can hear me. I mean, obviously, we sort of talked a little bit already about the sort of fracture between the developed and the developing world. Mm-hmm. And obviously, where you are, especially because it's also going to be the home of Africa, the home of COP27 as well. How will what surprised you so far in the way the conflict has affected the energy climate, calculus, I think, play out in the coming year, and the extent to which it will also affect the dynamics around COP27 as well, based on your description of a rather, drastic shift from being a utopia to grounded reality sphere when it comes to delivery of energy and climate goals. Saleem.
So I think the first thing is that I think most of us were surprised that coming out of the pandemic and maybe other crises, and suddenly we into a war in Europe. I don't think anybody expected that. And just the nature of the reaction to the war compared to other places sort of exposed, in my view, a lot of hypocrisy around the nature of war, geopolitical interests, and so on. But I think on the continent, we are, I thought we were on a good footing to, in a sense, push high levels of clean energy transitions, but the reorientation of supply is reinforcing what were already pre the war, a resurgence in a new narrative around the importance of gas as a transition fuel on the continent, largely strengthened and abated, enabled by demand outside of the continent. And this situation is actually reinforcing that. But as I said, I think the demand may actually create also an opportunity to lower dependency of use of gas, gas to power in particular, and for industrial use, very harder for other types of sectors like fertilizers and so on, for a higher threshold of cleaner energy solutions. simply because there's more premium to be made out of exports than, and so we're seeing a revival of new pipelines and new investments, which is fascinating, which we didn't expect would happen before the war. Thanks.
Great. So the sort of response to the dash for gas is equally big a dash for renewable projects to demonstrate the viability at the same time, which I think is a good way to sort of bring to Jonathan's question around short-term versus long-term. And I'm going to use this opportunity to get our audience to start catching my eye and raise hands to ask your question as well. So, Jonathan, why don't you sort of expand a bit more, in terms of what surprised you and therefore what it means in terms of the question that you posed, which is the dilemma really between short and the long term, being unable to plan for every eventuality in the way that we would like to be able to do so.
Yeah. So thanks very much. Just a couple of things, and I hope you guys on the screen can actually hear, but just a couple of things. The first one is that I was quite surprised in some ways by how much money governments were prepared to spend in the pandemic, and how quickly they spent it. The pandemic spending was about $7 trillion over the course of about a year. We have historically in our community thought that you could raise maybe a few tens of billions from government. 7 trillion is a really big number, and I don't think any of us anticipated that. And what was fascinating is where it went. It was not devoted to these kinds of questions. It was devoted to a set of issues that in some ways perpetuate the status quo and didn't change the outcome very much, and therefore didn't give us much capacity to prepare for the next shock. We could have used the pandemic as a moment to think about food, which is going to be a huge problem this winter as we look at the decline in capacity from Russia and from Ukraine. And it's going to play out in Africa. And it's exacerbated by the climate change shift that we're seeing that's leading, at least at the moment, to projections of less than average supply from the US and from Brazil. That's a combination of factors that have come together around which we are not prepared, and yet where we could imagine movement, and yet governments are not obviously making that the point of their focus.
Thank you. You just reminded me that after Davos, there was all the discussion about what was being discussed, and I thought it was about politics, policy, polarization, and someone said, no, it's conflict, climate change, and COVID. Yeah, it's a squeeze in a very different way. I think it's a good time to sort of bring some more questions on the audience as well. We've got a large cluster over there, so our very kind microphone folks would be able to get, maybe we start from the right at the back with the colorful clothing, or colorful black and white, colorful by my standard, but yes, sorry.
Good afternoon.
Please introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and then ask the question.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Ndombi. I'm studying at the University of Reading, but I'm originally from South Africa, Cape Town, South Africa. So my question is posed to Saleem on his recent calls that he's made upon African governments to shift the narrative of the climate transition from one focusing on Africa as a risk to the global drive towards the decarbonization to a constructive narrative on opportunities. How does he propose this to happen, and what response would he expect to get from African governments, and how would they be able to rally around this call or this vision? Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Great. We'll take the one in front as well, right in front, just right next to Anthony there. And then we'll collect three, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Yeah, thank you. Anthony Froggatt from Chatham House. Firstly, thanks, Jonathan, for the emphasis on the short term, because I do think it's absolutely critical. Next 12 months, in Europe in particular, we will see higher energy prices to the extent that people can't afford it, and we'll see people not being able to be supplied. So one of the responses that you talked about for that was about importing more LNG. And I think absolutely it's part of the strategy, but we mustn't underestimate the impact that that has on other markets. So we're seeing places like Bangladesh now no longer being able to afford LNG because it's being priced out. What does that mean? It means coal in other places. So the extent to which things are exported, the energy security risk is exported to other countries needs to be thought through. And then finally, Bernice won't be surprised, I'm going to make a little dig on energy efficiency. We heard this morning from the Minister, he had to put 5 words on energy efficiency in a speech of 20 minutes. He said, further, we will have measures on energy efficiency. And it really is disastrous if this government and other governments in the world do not put energy efficiency first and foremost in their energy security strategy. So I'd just like to hear more from the panel in terms of what can we do in the next 12 months on energy efficiency? And what structural changes do we need to put in place?
Thanks, and maybe the person in the white shirt there, yeah.
Thanks a lot. Sam Alvis, Head of Economy at Green Alliance and a panel of young advisors at Chatham House. Our energy security in the future is going to rely quite heavily on our resource security, and that's going to create some winners and losers in geopolitics. One of the ways Western countries are looking at that is increasingly moving to the circular economy, recycling, reusing, etc. But that is going to widen the gap between the developing world and the developed world if we friendshore or reshore. Is there a way we can build secure green supply chains, or are we going to have to give something back to the countries that we're not buying raw materials from?
Thank you. I think we'll close it here, and then maybe have another round later. There's obviously the other person in white as well after that, and then we have more, hopefully. So, I mean, we have 3 questions at the moment. I would like to all of you, I mean, obviously one directed to Saleem, but I actually think that others should also comment as well, if possible, around the question of narratives and how these narratives of opportunities are received by governments. I think the question around efficiency, of course, extremely important. That is often seen as the easy thing to do, when in fact it's actually hard and not easy, because institutional barriers are often higher than anticipated. The 3 of you who have been in government, I'm going to ask you, particularly on that, you must have experience in terms of pushing demand-side measures, including deficiency. And what is your lesson, between the 3 of you, that you can draw from having been in government at different times in terms of pushing demand-side measure? And the last question is, in fact, partly the opportunity narrative, which is really a question around what are really the opportunities, given all the geopolitics around supply chain, to really build green and sustainable supply chains amidst all the friend-shoring, ally-shoring, reshoring discussions. Thank you. With that, and who would like to take that on first?
If I could say something about energy efficiency, and I agree, we need a huge focus on energy efficiency right now. And if you look at the IEA makes recommendations on what Europe should be doing right now immediately, and I appreciate Jonathan's focus on the here and now. It was a little pessimistic. I'm usually the pessimist. He's the optimist. But what we can do to focus right now, efficiency is important. But I would add something that it makes me crazy, is that we have forgotten about conservation. It used to be, and when the Department of Energy in the US was founded, it was about conservation. You can have the most efficient economy in the world and still use more energy. And I think that we need to be focusing right now on how we can conserve energy and not use it. And I'll give you an example. It makes me crazy when I go into the ladies' room at the airport and I need a sensor to pull a paper towel out of the machine. I am perfectly capable of pulling a paper towel out of a machine. I don't need a sensor. I don't need to touch anything. Okay, it's not an issue of being sanitary, et cetera, et cetera. And you see that everywhere. I was in Bulgaria a couple months ago. I couldn't figure out how to open my drapes. I had to push a button to open my drapes.
So in terms of policy, though, what are the policies to encourage us to use less and reduce demand? And in fact, the specific question is what we can do in the next 12 months as well, right?
Right, and I think doing a quick assessment of what we can do basically mechanically as opposed to using electricity is something that's very important.
Great. Saleem, do you want to come in for the question as well, and then we can come back to Meghan and Jonathan as well. Saleem,
sure.
Narratives, opportunities.
I want to thank Tommy for the question, and just to say that the reason we are wanting to change the narrative is simply because the development issues have to be combined with the climate agenda on the continent. Largely, climate diplomacy, climate issues are seen as sort of very much a cottage industry isolated from the rest of the real economy. And I think as the African Climate Foundation, we want to change the debate. We want to argue that climate and the development nexus go together, that actually if you recognize that climate vulnerable sectors are imposed with a risk of extreme weather, but they are also a way of reconfiguring how you align your investment strategy. to protect those vulnerable sectors. And I refer to agriculture. The second part that is not really invested in for some reason is the energy transition, even though Africa is very decarbonized, except for South Africa. And we have, for example, the Just Energy Transition Partnership in South Africa, which is, in my view, a very interesting and excellent model, which is now being adopted by, or being sought to be replicated in places like Egypt, Nigeria, and Senegal. So we should see climate and NDC targets as a way to channel new kinds of investment in climate vulnerable sectors for the infrastructure that we need, which is clean energy infrastructure at the cheapest cost possible.
Thanks for that, Saleem. I think that maybe, if I may, I actually want to call it segue to Meghan for the question around the green supply chain. I mean, in the article you wrote with Jason recently in Foreign Affairs, you mentioned, for example, some of the questions around supply chains as well. So I thought maybe it would be a good way for you to sort of look at how do we create the possibility for the green sustainable supply chain amidst the geopolitical reshaping that we're seeing right now.
Sure. I was going to let Jonathan go because he's always bringing up the rear, which is always the hardest job. But let me make two comments. If I could just say very quickly on the energy efficiency question, to the question, what needs to be done? The way I'd like to answer that is what needs not to be done are actually a lot of the policies that are being considered and have been put into place in various countries. So if you look and you see what the very short-term reaction of governments, it has been to try to subsidize, to try to shield consumers from high prices. In the United States, there's a very active debate here with President Biden speaking to the nation yesterday, calling for suspension of the gas tax. So that's a tax on petrol in the United States. This, of course, we can debate how useful that will be and what the impact is, but that goes in the direction of actually encouraging more demand rather than having the opposite, which is what we need, is to discourage demand, although there are different ways to bring about better efficiency and less demand. On the friendshoring, I think this is one of the really big questions, and as it relates, it's not only to do with critical minerals, but obviously that's a very important issue, and it has the attention of a lot of policymakers. You had Secretary Yellen here in the United States a couple of months ago make a comment about how the U.S. is going to move more in the direction of friendshoring for supply chains, and that actually caused a lot of debate among analysts who said, this is the downside of this is we're moving away from a global trade, a globalized economy, which is one of the ways that we ensure security. But I think we are now moving into this world where we have really difficult policy trade-offs. And I think the questioner implied that somehow this would exacerbate tensions between the developed and developing world. And I wouldn't necessarily see that as so, because a lot of the friendshoring, it isn't about just sourcing things from within the developing world. It's more sourcing things from countries that, perhaps you have better political relationships with, maybe have more compatible political systems or more predictable political systems. So I think that doesn't, that there's a lot of talk about linking countries in Latin America that are very resource rich in terms of some of the critical minerals with the US and finding ways in which that the processing of some of these minerals can be done that doesn't involve the resource first going to China. So I think that there is scope for that. And I do think that it does come with the risk of, adding another impetus onto the trend of deglobalization. So I'd say that as being one of the trends. On the article that you mentioned that Jason Bordoff and I recently wrote in Foreign Affairs, very briefly, I would say this is an area, the critical minerals, where I do see that there will be more need for government involvement if, in fact, these supply chains are going to be geopolitically de-risked somewhat because of the very real impediments to getting more production in the United States and in other parts of the world. And then, simultaneously, a huge effort to try to come up with recycling and alternative materials to substitute for these critical minerals. But that, of course, creates disincentives for the private sector to invest today. So again, there'll be needs for more government policies to try to incentivize the private sector in the short term without undermining, this is very similar to the climate energy security debate, undermining the effort to ultimately reduce dependency on these materials.
Great, thank you. Well, we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to do a Leslie Vijamari special just now, which is to say 5 minutes left. 2 questions. All of you have 30 seconds to respond after that. So let's take these two here, the two here at the front.
I think we should start with Jonathan when we respond.
He will have a chance to speak, don't worry. Please.
Okay.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, good day, everyone. I'm Natalia Katzer-Wyszkowska. I'm former member of Ukrainian Parliament and founder of Ukrainian Sustainable Fund. So it was very interesting discussion about energy security. And I completely agree with outcomes of these discussions that in short-term period it would be shock for energy transition, and then the world will reshape energy security and energy system will reshape. But the critical issue, the war is still going on, and we do not know the outcomes. So, well, at the moment there is a severe fights in the east, in the south of Ukraine. So we have the biggest gas transition system in Europe, which is Europe actually sourcing gas through the Ukraine, and we do not know would it exist next month or not. What would be with the gas storages? You also see that last couple of days there is a significant decrease of transported gas through the Turkish streams, through the Nord Stream 1. So everything can change every minute, and Europe's still dependent on Russian gas supply. So the question is to the audience and to the panel, what are you thinking about, like, just next winter? How the Europe will react, how the world will react to this current crisis?
Thank you. The lady next to it, next to your microphone, and then 20 seconds. Everybody, 20 seconds.
Yeah. Laura Sullivan from We Move Europe. Just on Jonathan Pershing's point about the short-term, long-term, if that's pretty terrifying. And if that is the case, what is your theory on what is going on there? Because if the reason to have the gas dash conversations is not some kind of humanitarian, let's save lives this winter, then what's going on? And related to that, if it's about war and not bankrolling Putin's war in the Ukraine, but it's also about climate change. So why are, for example, the likes of the European Union, beyond Fit for 55, issuing a taxonomy which includes gas as green?
Okay, so 10 seconds each, our panelists. I mean, obviously, I'm exploiting all of you. Jonathan, please.
I just get to start for 10 seconds. 2 quick comments then. The first one is with our first question just now on Ukraine and what comes next. I don't think that's yet been considered adequately. That's the question for all of us. I think there's the war itself, which is an unknown outcome, but not looking promising at the moment for the East. Hopefully less so for other parts of the nation, but it's incredibly not just disruptive globally, but a catastrophe at home. So I think we all look at that and don't have answers for you in that domain. It does have implications on our global security discussion, which what we've been talking about. And to the second question, I don't think we have an answer besides curtailment. And the question of what do you curtail has got to be carried out, in my mind, in the context of what your medium-term expectations are. If gas returns to a low price, you'll do something. If gas never returns to a low price, you have a different choice. If it turns out gas is not available, you'd have even a different choice still. And this brings us back to the question earlier. If it doesn't come to Europe or goes to Europe and doesn't go to Bangladesh, that has huge implications globally.
Yes. That's right. Melanie, 10 seconds.
I would say on what comes next, again, we don't know what's coming next. And I do think that we need to plan for Russian gas to not be part of our security equation, and to the degree we can, and there's very little that can be done in the near term. We have to do all the things that we can, but for the midterm, we need to plan for additional gas. Another thing I would say, and I was from the conversation this morning as well, that there is no substitute for natural gas in industrial uses, except for hydrogen. Okay, you need a fuel. And there wasn't a lot of discussion. There's always a discussion about electricity and home heating, not about industry. And you need high quality process heat for industry. We need to think about that for the future as well.
Great. So 10 seconds, Saleem. 10 seconds, Meghan.
Very quickly, I think we are in what Gramsci called an interregnum between the old and the new. We are in a transition hiatus. And I think that the decisions we make now are very important, but they're not going to be easy. We have. I think we have delayed. We should have started the ramp up many years ago. We are now caught off guard by the war, and I think we're living through a very immense, uncertain period, even for both energy security and climate security. Thanks.
Thank you. Meghan?
Just in 10 seconds wrap up, I'd like to just thank the first questioner for bringing us back to the reality that we are still very much in the middle of a very tragic war in Ukraine, and that its outcome is very uncertain. And the outcome of that war is going to reverberate through every single dimension that we have discussed over the course of the past hour. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Now, my takeaway, my 1 second version is plan for the worst case scenario, but at the same time, we have no choice but to deliver all of the above, is what I'm hearing from all our panelists in the short term as well as the midterm. So more planning, more demand destruction is important. The next session that will take place here is governance of a more splintered digital world. It will be here in the main conference hall, and we're running late. And then there's a session on defense capabilities expenditure in the wake of the conflict in Ukraine and China-Russia relations, and a true partnership access of convenience will begin in the breakout rooms upstairs. Now with that, please join me in thanking our rather game panelists for this excellent panel. Thank you.